For most of the early war years, the skies over Europe felt like a brutal but predictable battlefield. The Luftwaffe had been fighting non-stop since 1939, and even after staggering losses on the Eastern Front, it still maintained an intimidating presence in the West. American bombers were pouring into the conflict, but without the right escort fighter, the long-range missions into German territory were almost suicidal. Entire bomber formations were being torn apart before they even reached their targets. What the Allies needed wasn't more firepower, it wasn't heavier armor. What they needed was a fighter that could survive the journey from England deep into the heart of Germany and still have the strength and the fuel to fight. Nobody expected that solution to arrive as quietly as it did. It didn't enter the war with fanfare or hype. It didn't show up with a terrifying nickname or a dramatic unveiling. But when the P-51 Mustang made its first serious appearance above Europe, something in the air war shifted immediately. There was no lightning bolt announcement, no grand moment where the Luftwaffe understood what was coming. The change didn't feel like a knockout punch. It felt like pressure, subtle at first, but rapidly growing. Like the walls of the sky were closing in around them. German pilots had grown used to certain rhythms in combat. They launched intercepts knowing American bombers would eventually be forced to defend themselves alone. They knew exactly where U.S. fighters had to turn back, because earlier escorts simply couldn't fly another mile without risking a dead-stick landing somewhere in enemy territory. That boundary, that invisible line in the air, had shaped the entire strategy of the Luftwaffe. But now, almost overnight, it didn't exist anymore. Suddenly, the bombers weren't alone. Fighters were still with them. But not just any fighters, machines with the speed to chase, the range to linger, and the power to challenge the Luftwaffe's best veterans head-on. At first, German squadrons didn't believe what they were seeing. A few pilots assumed the Mustangs had simply pushed too far and would fall away any minute. Others thought American engineers must have cut corners somewhere, or that these planes were running dangerously low on fuel. Some commanders even suggested the sightings were misidentifications, the mind playing tricks in the chaos of combat. But within days, the truth hit them hard. The P-51 wasn't bluffing. It wasn't overextended. It wasn't some experimental curiosity. It was the new reality of the war, a reality the Luftwaffe had no plan for. Every mission suddenly carried new risks. Every approach had to be re-evaluated. The airspace they once treated as home turf was slowly becoming hostile territory. And for the first time since the war began, many German pilots felt something they'd never experienced before: doubt. Because if these Mustangs could fly this far, fight this hard, and keep coming back for more, what else were they capable of? And what happened next would leave the Luftwaffe scrambling for answers. Long before the Mustang arrived, the Luftwaffe had every reason to think it controlled the skies. It wasn't arrogance, at least not entirely. It was confidence built on years of lightning-fast victories, brutal experience, and a system that pushed pilots into combat from the moment they proved they could handle a cockpit. By 1943, even with losses mounting, many German commanders believed that no matter what aircraft the Allies sent, the Luftwaffe could adapt and push it back. They had done it with the RAF early in the war. They had faced overwhelming numbers on the Eastern Front, and they had brought down thousands of Allied bombers over Western Europe. To them, the idea that a single new fighter could upset the balance seemed impossible. Their confidence hinged on a simple truth: their aircraft were built for the fight they expected. The Bf 109 was a compact, powerful dogfighter, deadly in the hands of a veteran. The FW 190 hit hard, rolled fast, and could rip through bomber formations with frightening effectiveness. Together, these fighters were optimized for the German method of air combat: short-range intercepts, high-altitude dives, and quick strikes before returning home to refuel. It was a system designed for Europe's dense geography, where airfields were close and missions were short. This approach made perfect sense early in the war. Germany didn't need fighters that could roam for hours. It needed fighters that could climb quickly, hit fast, and overwhelm enemies before they had time to react. Even when the U.S. Army Air Forces arrived with the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, German pilots remained convinced they could break these formations through sheer aggression. They had studied bomber weaknesses, memorized attack angles, and practiced coordinated strikes that tore entire squadrons apart. And at first, it seemed like nothing could disrupt this rhythm. American bombers flew deep into German territory, but their escorts, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, always had to turn back long before the bombers reached the most important targets. Every time those escorts peeled off, German fighters attacked with overwhelming force, like wolves waiting for the shepherds to leave the herd. The Luftwaffe believed this pattern would continue forever. Their whole defensive strategy relied on it. Behind the scenes, though, cracks were already forming. Ground crew shortages, fuel constraints, and relentless missions had stretched Germany's pilot corps dangerously thin. Replacement pilots were entering combat far too early, facing Allied forces with only a fraction of the training their predecessors had received. Still, German commanders brushed these issues aside, convinced their veteran aces could carry the burden. So when rumors spread that the Americans had a new fighter with unusual range, few paid attention. German intelligence dismissed early reports as exaggerations or Allied propaganda. Even when a handful of pilots claimed they'd seen a new, sleek fighter escorting bombers farther than usual, most Luftwaffe leaders assumed the escorts would still turn back, just as they always had. But that assumption wouldn't just be wrong, it would be catastrophic. Because the Mustang wasn't another short-range escort. It was about to follow the bombers all the way into Germany, and all the way back out again. And once that reality hit, the Luftwaffe's sense of invincibility would shatter almost overnight. What makes the P-51 Mustang's rise even more surprising is that it didn't begin as an American masterpiece at all. It started as a rushed solution to a British problem. In 1940, with Europe burning and the RAF desperate for more fighters, Britain approached North American aviation with a request: build licensed P-42s as fast as possible. Instead of copying existing designs, the engineers proposed something bold, a completely new aircraft that could be built quickly, cheaply, and with performance that matched the RAF's needs. Nobody expected anything extraordinary from it. It was supposed to be a good enough fighter, a temporary stopgap, but what emerged was a sleek, aerodynamic machine, with a low-drag laminar flow wing and a frame begging for more power than its first engine could offer. That first version, powered by the Allison V1710 engine, wasn't the game-changer it would later become. At low altitudes, it performed well, even exceptionally, but the moment it climbed higher, it lost breath and speed. It couldn't challenge the Luftwaffe, where most of the war's critical air battles were actually happening above 20,000 feet. For a while, the Mustang seemed destined for reconnaissance, ground attack roles, and low-level duties. A fine airplane, but nothing historic. But then came the turning point. British test pilots began experimenting with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire and helped Britain survive the Battle of Britain. As soon as the Merlin was fitted to the Mustang's airframe, something clicked. The aircraft transformed. Climb rate jumped. High-altitude performance surged. Speed skyrocketed. The Mustang suddenly had everything it needed: power, endurance, and an aerodynamic advantage that let it slice through the air with almost effortless efficiency. It became not just competitive, but dominant. The U.S. Army Air Forces immediately recognized what this meant, not just for individual dogfights, but for the entire air strategy. Every bomber mission into Germany had been paying a toll in lives and machines because escorts simply couldn't go the distance. But the Mustang, with the Merlin engine, external fuel tanks, and incredibly low fuel consumption for its performance, could finally escort bombers from England all the way to their targets and back again. No turning back early, no leaving formations exposed, no predictable withdrawal point that German fighters could exploit. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was the answer to a problem the Allies had been struggling with for years. The P-51 wasn't designed to change the war, but now it was positioned to do exactly that. What caught the Luftwaffe off guard was how rapidly this transformation happened. German intelligence didn't track the Mustang's evolution closely. Many assumed it was just another American experiment, nothing that would alter the strategic balance. They had no clue that the Merlin-powered Mustang was about to sweep into Europe with a combination of speed, altitude, performance, and, most importantly, extreme range that no German fighter could match. And once those Mustangs started flying deep into German airspace, the entire foundation of the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy began to crack, because this new fighter wasn't simply strong, it could be everywhere, at once. The moment the Mustang arrived with its full range unlocked, the entire map of the European air war changed. Before that, the Luftwaffe operated with a huge strategic advantage. They knew exactly how far American escorts could go. They knew where those fighters would turn back, where bombers would suddenly become vulnerable, and where German interceptors could strike with overwhelming force. Those invisible boundaries in the sky made the defense of Germany predictable, manageable, almost routine. But when the P-51 entered the fight with enough fuel to cross the entire continent and return home without gasping for fumes, that invisible line disappeared. Overnight. For German pilots, range wasn't just a number, it was the foundation of all their tactics. The Bf 109, for example, was a superb dogfighter, but its fuel capacity was tiny. Most missions lasted minutes, not hours. The Fu 190 carried more fuel, but still couldn't roam far from its airfields without risking a disastrous engine-out landing. This meant Luftwaffe fighters had to wait near specific zones they knew bombers would pass through, launch quickly, fight fast, then retreat before fuel gauges started dropping into the danger zone. The entire system was a series of controlled bursts, not long hunts. The Mustang flipped that reality upside down. Suddenly, U.S. fighters didn't just accompany bombers. They patrolled far ahead of them. They waited at altitudes and locations where German interceptors used to gather. They loitered above German air bases, forcing pilots to fight the moment they took off. Instead of the Luftwaffe dictating the terms of engagement, the Americans now had the endurance to linger, chase, and return for multiple passes in a single mission. The psychological pressure alone was crushing. Before the P-51, German pilots knew they could often break away from American escort fighters simply by outlasting them. The Thunderbolts and Lightnings had range, but not enough. At a certain point, they always had to go home. Once the sky cleared of escorts, German fighters surged in, confident they could attack bombers without interference. Those final legs of a bombing run were where Luftwaffe pilots scored many of their most devastating kills. But now, even after an hour of combat, the Mustangs were still there. They didn't peel off. They didn't give German fighters any opening. Worse, the Mustangs didn't just hover near the bombers. They went hunting. Long-range missions turned into aerial ambushes, where German fighters found themselves outnumbered and burned out before they could even reach engagement altitude. And when they tried to retreat, the Mustangs still had the fuel to chase them home. Germany couldn't copy this capability. They lacked the oil reserves to build long-range fighters, their engines burned too much fuel, and their production system was already collapsing. Even if they wanted to create a Mustang equivalent, the internal resources simply weren't there. Range wasn't just a technical detail, it was the single advantage the Luftwaffe had built its entire strategy around. And once the P-51 erased that edge, Germany's defensive air war entered a downward spiral that no amount of bravery or experience could stop. But the real collapse came when those outdated tactics, the same ones that once kept bomber crews awake at night, suddenly fell apart in the face of this new threat. For years, the Luftwaffe's defensive system functioned like a well-rehearsed script. Radar stations spotted incoming bombers. Controllers vectorized interceptors into position. Squadrons massed above the expected route, then swooped down in coordinated waves designed to rip open bomber formations before the gunners could react. This rhythm was deadly, efficient, and familiar. Even as resources thinned, the underlying formula still worked until the Mustang arrived and rewrote every rule at once. The German approach depended heavily on timing. Intercepting bombers wasn't as simple as charging head-on. It required precision. Pilots needed altitude. They needed formation discipline. They needed to gather in critical numbers before making the first strike. A lone Bf-109, diving into a box of B-17 seconds wasn't a hero, it was a target. What made the Luftwaffe dangerous was their ability to swarm, hit from multiple angles, and then vanish before the escorts caught up. But once the P-51 began patrolling far ahead of bomber streams, these massed formations never fully materialized. The moment German fighters climbed to their rendezvous altitude, Mustangs were already waiting above them. Instead of building up for a synchronized attack, flights were torn apart before the battle even started. A routine climb became a gauntlet. Groups that were supposed to merge into large strike formations were scattered into isolated pockets, each one hunted on its own. The Luftwaffe's signature high-altitude boom and zoom tactics, dives from above the bombers, firing in one deadly pass, then climbing away, also unraveled. The Bf-109 could climb well, but not after burning precious fuel dodging Mustangs during ascent. The full 190 could strike hard, but it wasn't built to run from a determined pursuer over long distances. Mustang pilots didn't simply break up attacks. They stayed on their targets long after the initial engagement. German fighters could no longer attack with the confidence that they could disengage cleanly. Even worse, the Luftwaffe found itself forced into fights it never wanted. Defensive scrambles that once lasted minutes now stretched into prolonged battles across vast sections of airspace. Every moment spent dogfighting drained fuel that German aircraft couldn't spare. Pilots were landing with tanks nearly dry, engines sputtering as they touched down if they made it back at all. American escorts often swept over airfields the moment German fighters tried to retreat, turning landings into desperate races for survival. The shift wasn't just tactical, it was emotional. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots, men who had survived hundreds of sorties, felt the pressure mounting. Their old instincts still worked, but the environment around them had transformed. The predictable windows of opportunity had vanished. Every decision carried higher risk. Younger pilots, rushed into combat with minimal training, struggled to grasp the old methods at all. The sky that once offered structure now felt like chaos. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe wasn't fighting organized battles. It was reacting, scrambling to plug gaps, improvising midair, trying to survive the slow tightening of an enemy that refused to turn back. And as the Mustangs began claiming more kills, a dangerous imbalance formed. Germany was losing its most experienced pilots, while America was gaining confidence, numbers, and momentum. But the true breaking point wasn't tactical at all. It was human, because the men the Luftwaffe relied on most were being pushed into an unwinnable war of endurance. By the time the P-51 began dominating German airspace, the Luftwaffe's greatest strength had become its greatest vulnerability: its aces. Unlike American pilots, who rotated home after a set number of missions, German pilots stayed in combat indefinitely. There was no break, no reset, no chance to decompress from the constant strain of aerial warfare. Many had been fighting since Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. Their skills were unmatched, but their exhaustion was real. These were pilots with hundreds of kills, but also hundreds of life-or-death engagements weighing on their shoulders. On paper, Germany still had some of the best fighter pilots anywhere in the world. Names like Hartmann, Barkhorn, and Röhl were legends. But the war they were fighting in 1944 wasn't the same as the one they had mastered earlier. The skies had become crowded with American aircraft, and the Mustang's arrival turned every mission into a marathon instead of a sprint. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots weren't afraid of the enemy, they were worn down by the impossible math of it all. The Mustangs didn't give them space to breathe, much less the chance to dictate the terms of a fight. Meanwhile, American pilots were entering the war with something the Luftwaffe no longer had the luxury of providing: structured training, replenished manpower, and steady rest cycles. A U.S. pilot might complete his tour and then head home with all the knowledge he'd gained, contributing to the next generation of airmen. Germany couldn't afford that. Every skilled pilot stayed in the fight until wounds, fate, or fuel shortages removed them from the roster. And with each loss, Germany wasn't just losing a man, it was losing irreplaceable expertise. Then the Mustangs started doing something the Luftwaffe had never faced on this scale: aggressive, offensive sweeps. Instead of waiting for German fighters to attack the bombers, P-51 pilots dove straight into German airspace to hunt. They attacked interceptors before they reached altitude. They chased damaged fighters across miles of sky, and they caught aces returning to base with empty fuel tanks, striking at moments when Luftwaffe pilots were used to being safe. It was like fighting two battles at once, one in the air and another against the clock. This created a devastating cycle. As veteran pilots fell, Germany replaced them with young men who barely had enough flight hours to handle emergencies, much less survive a swirling, multi-layered air battle. The Luftwaffe once offered its rookies months of rigorous training. By 1944, many were getting weeks. Some barely made it to the front before their first and often last encounter with a Mustang. American pilots noticed the shift immediately. Early in the war, every dogfight felt like a showdown with a master. But by mid-1944, Mustang pilots were encountering opponents who were clearly inexperienced, overshooting turns, stalling in climbs, or diving too steeply out of panic. The Luftwaffe's legendary edge was disappearing not because its aircraft were outdated, but because the men who understood how to use them were being lost faster than Germany could replace them. The Mustang didn't just overpower the Luftwaffe, it exposed the human cost of a strategy built on endless combat. And just as the pilot corps was unraveling, another crisis hit even harder. The very fuel needed to train the next generation began vanishing from Germany's war machine. Even as the Luftwaffe struggled to keep its veteran pilots alive, another crisis was quietly tightening around Germany's neck, one far more devastating than dogfights or Mustang sweeps. It began with the countless bombs falling on refineries, storage tanks, and chemical plants across the Reich. What those bombs destroyed wasn't just infrastructure. They destroyed time. They destroyed training. They destroyed the oxygen Germany's Air Force needed to survive. Fuel. Aviation fuel wasn't something Germany could simply replace with captured stock or improvised supplies. It required precise refining and additives that the Allied bombing campaign targeted relentlessly. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's fuel situation had gone from strained to catastrophic. Entire squadrons found themselves grounded, not because the enemy had defeated them in the air, but because they didn't have enough fuel to fly more than a handful of missions per week. And the little fuel they did have was usually reserved for veteran pilots or last-ditch defensive operations. Everyone else was left waiting on the ground, watching the war slip further out of reach. This shortage struck at the heart of Germany's training system. Before the war began, Luftwaffe pilots received hundreds of hours of flight time. They practiced formation flying, emergency procedures, blind approaches, gunnery drills, and complex maneuvers. They entered combat polished, confident, and prepared for almost anything. But by 1944, that training pipeline had collapsed. New pilots were lucky if they received 40 to 60 hours in the air, barely enough to understand the basics of their aircraft, much less master the subtle techniques needed to survive against Mustangs. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. American trainees still flew with abundant fuel, cycling through months of instruction, simulation, formation practice, and mock dogfights. They drilled until the controls felt like extensions of their own hands. And when these pilots were sent into combat, they weren't facing other novices, they were facing what remained of Germany's once-elite corps. But now, those aces were stretched thin, under immense pressure, and fighting alongside rookies who had barely enough experience to avoid stalling in tight turns. As training quality fell, the Luftwaffe's losses climbed even faster. Young pilots who should have spent months in preparation were rushed into frontline units, handed the keys to a Bf-109 or Fu-190, and told to follow their leaders into battle. Many didn't survive their first mission. Not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked hours. Hours Germany no longer had the fuel to provide. And every time a rookie vanished into the clouds, never to return, the Luftwaffe lost not just a pilot, but the possibility of future expertise. Its next generation was draining away before it ever had a chance to grow. Meanwhile, the Americans could now keep the pressure on continuously. Mustang escorts didn't just protect bombers, they smothered the Luftwaffe's ability to recover. Airfields were attacked, supply convoys targeted, repair crews pushed to their limits. There was never enough fuel, never enough parts, never enough time. Germany found itself trapped in a downward spiral. Without fuel, they couldn't train pilots. Without trained pilots, they couldn't protect the fuel plants. Without fuel plants, they couldn't fly at all. The Luftwaffe's strength wasn't just declining, it was imploding from within. And into this chaos came a desperate hope. New technology. Jet fighters. Secret weapons. Machines that, on paper, could have changed everything if the Luftwaffe had any strength left to use them. As Germany's air war spiraled into crisis, a new kind of hope began circulating through Luftwaffe command. The promise of breakthrough technology. Jet fighters. Rocket planes. High-speed interceptors. Machines so advanced they looked like they belonged in a different decade. On paper, these aircraft seemed capable of flipping the air war overnight. The Me-262 jet was faster than anything the Allies had. The Me-163 rocket interceptor could climb at unbelievable rates. Underground facilities were producing experimental aircraft meant to shock the world. If any of these machines reached full deployment, the Luftwaffe believed it might claw back control of the skies. But reality was far harsher. None of these weapons arrived in an environment capable of supporting them. The Luftwaffe that once had elite pilots, abundant fuel, and organized infrastructure was now fighting on fumes literally. Introducing advanced aircraft into a system that was already falling apart only magnified the weaknesses instead of solving them. Take the Me-262, the most famous of these wonder weapons. It was a technological marvel, capable of outrunning Mustangs with ease. But Germany didn't have the fuel to train pilots on jets. The aircraft required delicate handling, careful throttle control, and hours of familiarization. Yet many pilots transitioning to the Me-262 had barely flown piston fighters, let alone complex jets. A machine built for precision ended up in the hands of men forced into combat after only a few test flights. Mistakes were inevitable. Crashes became common. And even when the jets survived takeoff, they faced a bigger problem waiting for them on the ground. The jets were unbeatable in level flight, but they were vulnerable during the most critical moments of any mission: takeoff and landing. Their engines needed long runways and gentle throttle adjustments. They accelerated slowly at first, and they couldn't maneuver well at low speeds. Mustang pilots quickly learned this. They began haunting airfields, swooping down the moment jets lined up to land. It didn't matter how fast the Me-262 was in the air if it never made it back to the runway. The Me-163 rocket interceptor had its own dramatic flaws. It could climb like nothing else in the sky, but its fuel mixture was dangerously unstable. Training accidents were frequent and often fatal. And even when it reached bomber formations, it had only minutes of powered flight before turning into a glider, making it a target on the way down. Then there was the simple but devastating truth. These advanced aircraft needed skilled pilots, reliable production lines, and consistent supplies of rare materials. Germany had none of that left. Factories were bombed. Transportation networks were shattered. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. And the veteran pilots who could have mastered these machines had already been lost in earlier battles, replaced by young men with too little training and too few hours in the cockpit. The Luftwaffe wasn't lacking technological imagination. What it lacked was the foundation required to use that technology effectively. Even the most advanced aircraft couldn't save an air force that was collapsing from every angle. The Mustang hadn't just outperformed German fighters. It had arrived at the exact moment when Germany could least afford a new challenge. And by the time these secret weapons appeared in meaningful numbers, the sky above Germany had already been transformed forever. By the summer of 1944, the shift in the air war wasn't subtle anymore. It was unmistakable. The Mustang had been cutting deep into German air defenses for months, shredding formations, overwhelming interceptors, and haunting airfields from dawn until dusk. The Luftwaffe wasn't simply losing battles, it was losing the ability to even enter them. What once felt like a fierce contest slowly turned into a one-sided struggle where Germany fought not for control, but for survival. There wasn't a single day when everything collapsed. No dramatic announcement. No official moment when the Luftwaffe admitted the skies were no longer theirs. Instead, it felt like watching a structure crumble beam by beam. Each broken tactic, each lost ace, each grounded training flight, chipped away at a system already stretched to the breaking point. And, as Mustangs escorted bombers deeper into Germany than ever before, the air war evolved from a clash of fighters into a campaign of destruction aimed at the very heart of the Reich's industrial lifelines. Factories that once produced engines, aircraft frames, synthetic fuel, and spare parts now stood silent, twisted, or burning. Oil refineries vanished under waves of bombs. Rail lines were severed. Supply depots emptied. Even the airfields themselves, once symbols of German reach and power, became traps. Pilots who managed to return from combat often found the runways cratered, the hangars wrecked, and mechanics scrambling to keep a handful of flyable aircraft airworthy. Every flight carried the weight of a shrinking future. For the air crews on the ground, the change was obvious. The sky over Germany didn't sound the same. The deep engine roar of Bf 109 seconds, taking off in tight waves, became rare. Instead, the familiar hum of Mustangs echoed overhead, circling at ease, searching for signs of resistance. Civilians began to see American fighters in places they had never appeared before, far from front lines, patrolling regions many Germans once believed would remain untouched by the war in the air. And for the bomber crews who had endured the dark days of 1943, the difference was overwhelming. Missions that had once felt like near-certain death now felt survivable, almost routine. Losses dropped. Accuracy improved. Strategic bombing, once gambling with disaster, became a relentless, unstoppable force. The P-51 wasn't just protecting them, it was empowering them. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to meaningfully challenge Allied air power had vanished. Its squadrons still existed on paper, but most were shadows of their former selves. Some flew outdated planes. Others had almost no trained pilots left. And many never left the ground at all, permanently starved of fuel, spares, or the experienced officers needed to lead them. What the Mustang truly represented wasn't just technological superiority. It represented the moment when the Luftwaffe's long-standing advantages finally ran out. Germany couldn't replace its pilots fast enough. It couldn't rebuild its factories. It couldn't protect its fuel. And it couldn't stop the Americans from pushing deeper, staying longer, and striking harder than any air force before them. The P-51 didn't defeat the Luftwaffe alone, but it arrived at the exact moment when the air war was reaching its breaking point, and it turned that breaking point into collapse. It was the final piece in a puzzle Germany could no longer solve. The aircraft that closed the skies over Europe in a way no fighter had done before. And from that moment on, the Luftwaffe wasn't just outmatched, it was out of time.